There's a lot of stuff out there about coming out, coming into yourself, letting people in, figuring out your queerness. For me, and I think for a lot of other people, once I connected and integrated that part, all these other things started to make sense of why I was second guessing myself, why I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere, things that would seem unrelated. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have really been missing out. And I wonder if other people are missing out too.
Hola, hola. Welcome to Entre Tías y Amiguis, the podcast where we dive into the wild roller coaster ride of adulting. I'm your host, Adri Rodriguez, a queer Salvadorian native, a first-gen trailblazer, and licensed psychotherapist, here to share wisdom, stories, and real talk with my tías and amiguis to inspire and uplift our community. I want to remind you that while I am a licensed psychotherapist, this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Now let's dive into today's conversation and explore the journey of adulting together. Grab your cafecito, get comfy, and let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of Entre Tías y Amiguis. I'm your host, Adri Rodriguez, and I'm so excited to have a fabulous guest that I've been following the little threads here on social media. And then today, finally, we get to have a conversation. I have so many questions. I have so many wonderings. And to begin, Entre Tías y Amiguis, we always center those identities that are important about us, the ones that inform the lens that we're living in. Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself to us and share with our audience any identities that you would like for them to keep present as they listen to our conversation today?
My name is Sara Stanizai. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm the owner of Prospect Therapy here in Long Beach, California. I think identity is really important, but it's not everything. But I think my location where I'm coming from is my family is from Afghanistan. My sister and I were born here in Los Angeles. So I think we're second-gen immigrants, first-gen Americans, whatever you might call it. I am an openly queer person. I was raised Muslim. I grew up middle class. I mean, the list could go on. I think there's a lot of nuance about where people are coming from when they're speaking, but I think that is enough to start.
Sounds great. One of the things that, as I was kind of researching and putting some of the questions together for our interview, some of the things that highlighted for me is like your experiences as an eldest daughter. I myself am an eldest daughter. And so if you know what that means. Also a queer person who sort of strayed away from family cultural expectations. So would you be able to share with us how do these roles connect? What has been your journey to own up being openly queer, being a therapist, being a public figure on social media, taking space, helping others reclaim their culture? Could you walk us a little bit about those roles and how that origin story of getting you to being a therapist, to being out here doing this work?
Yeah, I think I kind of see a question go across people's face when I explain who I am and what I do. Being a cis person focusing on trans mental health, for example, it's always a little sus. But I think every time I talk about the work that I do and what's really important to me, people are always like, well, why do you care about that? As if like the obvious answer is like, why shouldn't we care about things or people other than us? But they are very specific themes. I built my practice around queer and trans mental health, around children of immigrants. It's grown into all these other specialties, but people often wonder, like, they kind of look at you and they're like, what's your story? What's your deal? And I've had to answer that question a lot. And I feel like every time I answer it, it's different. But I think all of the work professionally and personally that has been important to me, I think today the common thread might be people who feel sort of like black sheep, or I say often the outsiders are the insiders here. And it's probably a universal human experience to feel like you're the odd person out, that nobody understands you. These really existential questions, we all try to answer them with whatever tools we have. And so sometimes identity is really important. Sometimes our story and our history is really important. Sometimes just the present moment is important. And I try to bridge all of those things in my work, which is why I think why the answer is different every time, because, our perspective changes every time. I would say a common thread is people feeling sort of marginalized, people really yearning for community and belonging. And maybe the second thing is people feeling stuck in certain roles. I love being an eldest daughter. I love being a big sister. I love being a therapist and a leader and a employer, kind of. I love being an employer too. I have like ethical qualms about that, but I love being a queer person, but I don't want to only be that. I want to own identities, but I don't want to just kind of rely on them, because I want to be more than that. And I also want to encourage other people that you can also be more than that. And depending on where you are in your journey of like integrating all of those things, sometimes those things are very, very important to you. And yes, I do want this to be front and center. And other times people are like, friends will come to us and say, yeah, I'm queer, but that's not, I don't need help with that. Please, can we just talk about my boyfriend?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think those two themes kind of connect my work.
Mm-hmm. So, like, finding what is important to you in this moment and being able to make those connections. I guess what the thought that goes to my mind is like with this idea of marginalized identities, living on the fringes, not conforming to the status quo of what is expected of you. That can show up in so many ways. Like, it is part of, for me, being Latina, it's part of me being queer, but also all of those things also put me in this group of people in the outside that we may actually not have this very thing in common, but the experiences of belonging, the experiences of feeling ostracized, the pieces that bring you in and make you stronger, all of those things also connect despite some of these differences that we can have with one another. I went onto your website, and one of the quotes that you have that you highlighted that I thought was really interesting, that I connected with, was reconnecting to your culture on your terms is the most transformative self-improvement process. And I kind of want to start us talking there. And, Entre Tías y Amiguis is a space to share the stories of people who may feel like they're the only ones going through something. And oftentimes culture is kind of what brings us together. Many of our guests and our listeners are Latina, but I also know that this is not unique to the Latinx experience. So why is this idea of reconnecting to culture important to you? And how did you come to realize that you wanted to pay attention to it? Because you're right, there are many times in my life where my culture was not in the front and center. And at some point right now, it is, right? And so for you and some of the work that you do, there is that connection of reconnecting to culture.
Yeah, I think I have so many thoughts about this, but I think when you look at any sort of identity development, we all have these different phases. And sometimes we're actually very resistant to it. And we say, I don't want to claim this. I've had really bad experiences with it, whether it's, your cultural heritage, any part of your identity, especially when you're growing up in diaspora and you've gotten very specific messages about who those people are and where we belong. And, it's especially as you're growing up and you're having these formative experiences. I don't blame people for internalizing some of those ideas. We're swimming in it. I mean, it's everywhere. So I just want to acknowledge that that is also part of developing your identity. And people often feel shame and say, oh, I wish I spoke the language. I wish I had paid attention when somebody was trying to teach me how to cook these dishes or something like that. But I think that's why I think it's so transformative to kind of step back toward those things. Children of immigrants is kind of a buzzword now, but it is a very specific experience, that bicultural piece of like, well, I grew up in one way. I talk about like functioning one way and being perceived another. And so when your inside experience doesn't match the outside, which applies to so many people, it can cause some, what your supervisor might call dissonance or incongruence or whatever. So integrating those things and coming to it on your own terms means, well, I'm told this is either good or bad, and I can either do it the way my family did it, or I can completely ignore it. And for many of us, as we're growing up, we feel like those are our only two options. Well, I didn't start when I was 5 years old. I don't know. I can't do it now. All my family and people will think like, what I'm wearing a costume. I'm trying to pretend like I'm something I'm not. I was just talking about, I started using my middle name after really ignoring it, and just, I would never tell anybody. And I would say, oh, I don't want people to know it. It's Roshana, by the way. And it's my dad's mom's name. But when I started using it, people were like, oh, you're trying to like brown it up. And I was like, wait, the fuck? Like, this is actually my name. I'm not claiming something else. It's on my birth certificate. But anyways, so there's lots of ways that I tell people that you can reconnect to your culture, and it will help integrate not only that part of yourself, but it will also kind of give you answers for other things. In my experience, when I felt lost at certain times, or kind of at a crossroads, or didn't know what to do professionally or in a relationship or something, I didn't feel like I had that foundation to draw from. Or if I did, if I had a negative association with it. And so going back and remembering, my family's not the only place I can learn this from. Neither is these textbooks written by British dudes that I never heard of. There's now, because so many people, we have so much access to information, there are so many ways to learn things on your own terms. And the benefit of it is you're allowed to kind of pick and choose what resonates with you now and what feels like home, what feels familiar, what feels relevant for you now, rather than just saying, well, I have to do it this way and I have to take all the stuff that I don't like either. You actually don't have to do that. I know I said I had a lot of thoughts about it. I feel like I hope I'm
No,
making sense.
it makes sense. I mean, like what comes up for me is that, for example, I'm in a position where I'm estranged from my family, right? So several years ago, I found myself thinking about food, and I felt really sad. I felt like a load of grief of like the idea that I wouldn't get to learn the family recipes, right, from directly from my mom or directly from my grandma or directly from like one of my aunties, right? That I remember making this delicious food. And after the grief sort of passed, I remember going on YouTube and finding a bunch of moms from El Salvador that were teaching how to make like different dishes. And so then I kind of put it as a goal for myself to say, I'm going to teach every holiday season a new, very complicated dish that takes like 5 days to prepare. And that's why you only do it once a year because it's too much work. And so I didn't realize that for me, that food would be like a cultural component that would be important. But for me, food reminds me of like my childhood and where I came from. And then to be able to feed people food that to me feels like good and yummy, and then be able to share that experience of my culture with them is so special. But at first I would have not thought it was like, this is my process for identity development and
Yeah.
like integration, right? And like
Yeah.
to work against the dissonance that I'm feeling. I didn't even have the language. All I knew was that I had a longing to connect with a part of me that felt pushed to the side unintentionally because I had been in my 20s and I had been coming out and I had been going to grad school. I didn't have time to learn to cook tamales, like was not prioritizing that. But as that process kind of went on for me, it was a way of reclaiming. It was a way of determining like culture my way, like in my own terms. And so I think that I also see it in my practice or with friends, there's like black and white. Either you are all in Latina and you're all into the culture and you are talking in Spanglish or using a lot of just this very cartoon way of being Latina, or you're not. And you're just like, you're just whitewash or American, right?
Yeah.
But that is not necessarily true. You have the choice of dancing in and out with the aspects of culture that feel welcoming, that feel like home. There are parts of my culture that don't feel welcoming to me as a queer person. And I can see them, I can appreciate them, I can understand them, but I also don't want to interact with it. So that's what comes up for me as I hear you.
And remembering that even the version that we want to learn or that we want to learn from our family, that in itself is a complicated story. That itself is influenced by all these other things. There's no pure way of being Afghan or being anything. Like history shows that there's no like one way to do it. And so when we take something and we learn our own way of it, we're contributing to our own culture. It's not that we're just like pretending to be something. And also I really like what you said, that you went very quickly from like, I'm disconnected, I don't know how to do this, to I'm just going to look it up and do it myself and even share it and teach it to other people. And I want to remind people too that they're like, oh, who am I? I'm not a leader. I'm not contributing anything. But when you set a table for people, you are sharing your culture. You become the person showing other people that, oh yeah, you can do it too. And I've had that experience so much when I was doing my Afghan diaspora women's group. People would come in kind of looking to me like, oh, okay, this woman's going to teach me. And I'm like, I am actually not really teaching. I'm learning from you all too. But my hope is that people left that group saying, well, I always say like, you can be Afghan and be yourself. And I remind people you can be any identity and also be yourself. You're doing it your way. But I remind people that there's no test, there's no certification, there's no threshold that you have to meet. Once you claim it, you are a part of it.
The second part that from what you said earlier, that kind of is in my mind is the way that we internalize messages about our own culture that can also contribute as barriers to why do you feel so disconnected, right? Like, how did you get here to this place where you are wondering if you are Latina enough, if you're Afghan enough, how did we get here, right? And this is systemic. This is by design. This is white supremacy in practice, right? It is about erasure and about perpetuating messages that when you start to believe them, it can be really hard to unpack them. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do you see that in your community show up, the internalization of Islamophobia, for example, right? Or the the idea of like what a person from that part of the world should look like, act like, dress like. Can you talk about how the system sort of also influences our connection or disconnection to culture?
Girl, can I talk about it? Yes, I can. One thing I'll say before I forget is, I practice therapy from a feminist lens, which means we give equal weight to both our internal processes and our own temperament and our own history and attachment style and all those things, our own internal resources, and also the external systems that we live in. They both equally influence us. We can't just say, "Oh, it's all my fault because I don't have good enough self-esteem." And we also can't say, well, this is just the system and I'm totally helpless in it and this is how I have to be. And I think similarly, when people talk about wanting to reconnect to culture, particularly when they've had negative experiences with it, it's not enough to just say, well, the white man doesn't want you to like your culture, so that's why you don't like it. Because people will point to very real, often traumatizing experiences saying, white man didn't do this. Like I do not talk to my family. I've seen really awful things. I've experienced awful things. So, again, it's a balance of, I don't want to discount our own personal experience. And I also don't want to discount that, people are put in those positions to do those things. It does have really real effects on families. But I want to share that. And also I'll just say, I was in high school when 9/11 happened. Man, we got like 20 minutes into this before I said 9/11. I was like, I'm so annoyed that it keeps coming up. But it was such a formative, like, defining moment because I grew up and nobody even knew what Afghanistan was. I grew up in Los Angeles public school, like pretty diverse, all kinds of people. I was not the only one of anything in my school. And still, people were like, what's that? Or I remember people being like, what's Muslim? I'm like, you don't know what Muslim is, man? Like, so looking back on that, I'm like, wow, even in such a uh, diverse community, people still didn't know what to make of me. And even just how I present, some people think I'm a white girl. So a lot of people think I'm Latina. Like I got Japanese one time. I was like, I don't know what is happening, but that was surprising to me. So it's understandable that to me, it makes sense why I would have kind of pushed this part of my culture away because every time I brought it up, it wasn't negative. It just wasn't reinforced. Like nobody cared or knew what it was. So I just focused on other things. And then really overnight, it went from kind of neutral to the worst thing that you can be. And then I really had a choice. I felt like I had a choice to either continue ignoring it or distancing myself from it or being somebody who's like, oh, surprise, like, one of us. Guess what? I'm a regular person. I'm not all these weird manufactured things you think about me. And I chose to kind of start claiming that identity with very little foundation. Obviously, I had my family. English was not my first language. Obviously, I grew up in my culture, but it was the first time that I was really trying to claim it. And then people would ask me things or make comments, and I felt like I had to explain or defend myself. And I actually didn't have the tools to do it. I was like, I don't know. All I know is that's not true. So shut the fuck up. Like, so sorry, excuse me. And then as I grew into adulthood, that kind of continued. I remember people at work saying awful things. I remember people talking about us like we're animals and look at this video on YouTube. And it was real footage. I mean, I couldn't deny it. But I remind people that you don't have to be the only one. You don't have to speak for everybody. You can still just speak from your experience. It inspired me to learn more and reconnect and ask my dad things and look at my community in a different way and kind of be more curious rather than like almost allergic to it. And over time, you do develop your own opinions and you do understand what's going on, what you're looking at. And there is information available to you. That's kind of like speaking broadly, that was kind of what made me, I was sort of forced to, I guess. I wasn't really forced to, but I had a choice to make. And I was like, well, before it was something I could easily kind of ignore and it didn't mean anything. And it started to mean something if I was not going to claim it. And I was like, okay, well, all I know is I don't agree with what they're saying. So let me figure this out.
I think, probably it's important to say that we're recording right after this 2 weeks in Los Angeles, but all across the country where this anti-immigrant rhetoric and the ICE raids are happening, right? And I think that some folks that maybe have not found a reason to prioritize or to be thinking about their Latina identity may be finding themselves in a similar position of like, wait, I have to think about this part of myself right now. And it's not necessarily consensual. It's not like you went through a journey and said, like, what stage of my own identity as a Latina person am I in, right? Like, we are being forced to be thinking about layers of ourselves that we have had both the privilege, but maybe sometimes the unawareness that we wanted to center it, needed to center it. Also, the type of conversations that maybe families are having to face after moments like 9/11 or like the ice raids, and balancing that out of the system responsibility, the system accountability with also, but what am I going to do with this? Like you were saying, from like that feminist lens of like, we're not helpless in this situation, though we are deeply impacted by it. And so figuring it out, how do we interact with their identity? Sometimes it's a personal choice, and sometimes it's a choice made by the powers that be in the outside for safety.
Yeah, I don't want to discount that, some people do not have the privilege to be asking or answering these questions. And some people, it would be really nice to go out and whatever, wear my clothes and hold my signs and represent myself, but it's not a joke out here. So there's real life consequences and things to consider.
So I want to ask a little bit about more of your coming into, I want to try again my own Afghan identity, right? Like this is what I thought, what it was, is so my family sees it, but this is kind of mine. What was your journey? Was it the sociopolitical environment that kicked off that discovery? Was that just like like something is going on there, but I'm busy being 20, I'm in college, I'm doing all these things. What was your journey? And the reason I'm asking is because I can think of like some of the clients that I work with, or maybe some of the people in the audience that may feel, to your comment earlier, it's too late now to start interacting with these things. Now it feels fake. Now it doesn't feel real. How did you realize that this was something that was important to you to a certain degree to reconnect?
Well, I could tell you exactly when it was actually.
Okay.
It wasn't that long. It wasn't even in my 20s. So it's not too late, girl. But just so everybody knows.
It's not too late.
I had started my business, and I had always gravitated toward people who were like, oh, how I feel and how I'm seen is not matching up. And it's causing me this distress, and I don't really know why. And I don't know if it's not my fault. It's everybody else's fault. But I guess it is kind of my responsibility. Anyways, so I had been kind of circling this, and that was where my clinical focus was. And I started doing groups. I started doing group programs, and I was working with children of immigrants, which, by the way, somebody told me, like, that's not a thing. Like, you have to have a real specialty. Nobody's going to come to you just for this. And I was like, oh, okay, great. I'm glad you had that experience. And I was putting together this new program. I said, well, I've been doing these like children of immigrants groups, and I kind of want to like focus more in on like Asian or Arab communities. I'm getting closer to it. And the coach I was working with at the time said, why aren't you doing one for Afghan women? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I did not have a good reason. And I was like, I'm scared. I don't feel qualified. I've never done that. I don't feel like, who am I, the spokesperson? Like, I'm out here. I didn't feel like I was typically Afghan American. I was like, there's all these reasons why not to do it. And I could not stop thinking about it. And I did a lot of personal inventory and kind of exploring like what my problem was with it. And I had pieced together all of these things that I had learned over time, and I had never connected them to this part of my identity. There's a lot of stuff out there about coming out, coming into yourself, letting people in, figuring out your queerness, all these other things that people learn about themselves. I'm not a parent, but like the figuring out how adding parent to your identity, all these things that it changes. People talk about this stuff all the time, and there wasn't a lot of people talking about what it means to claim this part. And for me, and I think for a lot of other people, once I connected and integrated that part, all these other things started to make sense of why I was second guessing myself, why didn't feel like I belonged anywhere, things that would seem unrelated. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have really been missing out. And I wonder if other people are missing out too. And girl, I posted like one thing, and that shit filled up. That group sold out every time I did it. And I was like, oh my God, what is happening? And I realized just by the fact of admitting it and saying it out loud that I wasn't alone. And I became like obsessed with helping people also have that feeling. So I think that was the moment because somebody said, why not? And I was like, why not? And I did not have a good answer. I had plenty of answers, but I didn't have one that felt aligned with my values. And I'm like, that's bullshit. I should be doing this. And again, of course, not saying, oh, I'm the authority and the expert and let me teach you how to do this. It was not that. It was more like, let's come together. We're all feeling this way. We all learn from each other. And there are a lot of us. And so many times people would say, oh my gosh, I was looking for something like this. I couldn't believe I was looking at someone who said queer, Muslim, Afghan American woman, and you have tattoos. Like, what is happening? I've never seen this. There's a lot of risk that came with it too. It wasn't just a perfect experience, but the reward has definitely been worth it.
How do you think your training as a therapist supported or pushed you away from this? Because as you're talking to me, I'm thinking about all the ways that actually my grad school experience pushed me away from centering or from making it important. Even from one time I was wearing this like baby blue sweater and my professor is like, you're calling too much attention to yourself. And the other time I was wearing hoops and then he made a comment again. And then to a point that I just went in and okay, blank, no red lipstick, no hoops, no color, no anything. And so for me, my experience was you got to push yourself away from anything that calls attention to you or to this part of you. So what was your experience in your training as a therapist in regards making space for this type of work that then turned out to be so fulfilling?
Yeah, hoops and red lipstick and like whatever, I guess baby blue sweater, so controversial. Like that is blank in our community. It's like if I go in not wearing that, I will stand out. So I just always push back and be like, "Oh, blank slate. This is blank slate. Everybody's wearing this. Actually, oh, you look weird that you're not." Like, who gets to decide what is?
Mm-hmm.
That's why I don't like the word professional. But anyways, I digress. I also do coaching for other therapists who want to kind of start their practice or figure out how they want to run their business. And one of the first things I tell them is it's literally the opposite of everything you learned in graduate school and probably your practicum placements, your internships, that be as neutral as possible. Don't say anything about yourself. Like don't answer questions and just have that like therapist face. And I remind people, in some cultures, being very polite and not answering questions about yourself, in some cultures, that's like how you be polite and professional. And in other cultures, that is super offensive and makes people not trust you. And staying quiet and just waiting for them to talk is sometimes people will never talk to you again if you do that. And similarly, the other way, people love to say this is an ADHD thing. Maybe it is, but also in my culture, like interrupting and speaking on saying like and finishing someone's sentence and like speaking with them is a way that you show connection rather than just neutral ass, like pursed lip smile. Like can talk a lot about it. So I just remind people that it's better to be naturally yourself. That is always going to be the best way to connect with someone as a therapist. There is room for very quiet, introverted therapists. There is room for therapists who are like, come sit here with me. We're going to sit on the same couch together, like have this tea, have this pillow, let's talk. Additionally, what I've adopted for myself is you can be authentic, but it's not like a free for all. The rule that I use for myself that I've probably learned from a lot of supervisors is you share what you feel comfortable with. If anybody ever asked you about it, if it feels resolved enough for you, if you feel like you've healed or you're in a good enough place with it, that if somebody asked, you would feel confident in explaining it. Those are all the things that I share. I don't bring out things that would make me feel insecure or I'm sorry, I don't feel comfortable talking about that, or would maybe switch the power dynamic or something with a client. Not switch, but like kind of like shift the power dynamic, make them in the position of taking care of me, something, for example. I don't talk about those things. So basically I say if it's on the internet and you've seen me say it, it is fair game. I recognize that sometimes that will influence people, not just clients, but just people who might feel a certain type of way about that. But that's just being human. That's kind of like how we relate to each other. So I think it's impossible to set yourself up of like to constantly have your therapist hat on, to constantly be being neutral, whatever that means. So I don't try to say, 100% of the time everything has to be appropriate, clinically appropriate. But I do think that we can have intention behind what we share, and it can be a really great opportunity to show people what healing or integration looks like. And the last thing I'll say is sometimes people will say, oh, I need a referral for this type of client. There's childhood sexual abuse, there's queerness, there's something. And people will I would see people just say, oh, I have experience with this and this is part of my story. Like I specialize in this. And they said it so casually. And I was like, wow, these people really must be like healed about this shit. And now I am one of those people. So I just kind of use that as my internal barometer of if I would be comfortable with it, then yes, I can share it.
I think it comes with time, as it comes with knowing yourself to build that confidence, right? I know that for me, when I was a baby therapist and I had just gotten out of grad school and I had been told all these messages, yeah, a lot of the ways that I showed up and as a therapist were very prescriptive to what I thought a therapist should be like, meek and quiet, when I got my first shawl and like my cardigan
Hmm.
because that was professional, right? To your earlier point of just like what is a therapist supposed to be like? What is a Latina, queer, immigrant therapist supposed to be like? And we're having to figure it out what that is. You are maybe are going to be countering or the what you believe, what feels good to you with what you have been told is not good, and then trying to find an answer right in the middle. But I agree with you that the more connected that I feel with myself, the more that I have done my own work, the more that I know my own boundaries about, with the podcast, both of us having podcasts, the things that we're sharing, right? Like I didn't realize as an unintended outcome of having a podcast that I had to like renegotiate some of the boundaries of the things that I would never speak out loud and the things that I'm like, but actually I'm okay talking about that now because 5 years ago, I would have been like, I'm ass talking about that publicly. But now, after doing some of my work, getting to a different place, this is actually a part that I feel makes me stronger as a helper, as a human, as a person, parts of me that I really like. But it may take a while to deprogram some of the messages that you have heard and then to build that ownership to who you want to be and how you want to show up. And it takes time. It takes time for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, and sometimes it happens the hard way. I tell people not to repeat what I said. I tell people not to worry about trying to get it right all the time and just make sure that you have support and you have plans for what happens if it's not a good experience and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do now?
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
will also add, my first social service job was working in forensics in jail and prison. So the don't say anything about yourself part, very much appropriate for certain settings.
Necessary.
Yes. So I'm just not like, just go out here and say everything all the time.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. And that we as helpers and companions, we also have a right to safety and deserve to honor our boundaries and deserve to honor our own histories. And so the appetite for how much do you want to share or not share may change, may increase. And then sometimes you're like, oh, I went a little too far. Let me take a couple steps back. That is not something that works for me. The other thought that comes to mind is around culture, humility, culture competence, and things like that we're like, talk about in grad school. And I guess we also can risk making a lot of assumptions based on what trainings we've had or what we believe this type of person in therapy might need, right? Like, oh, this person comes from X culture, so I got to not make eye contact with them or not shake their hand or not look at them, right? And so balancing that out as well from the perspective of it's okay to not know and using the not knowing to invite your curiosity to build a bridge. And so you don't have to know the experiences of other people. You don't have to know specifically that actually could be harmful in some ways because you may be reinforcing stereotypes, and your good intention. And so as I heard you talk, this thought of like, how do we initiate conversation, especially when we're working with clients or with people, or even just in community with people who are different than us? How are you opening up those conversations about this is how I do it. How does it look like in your world?
Yeah.
Because that conversation sometimes we haven't had. And it's part of why we have to shut down so much of ourselves at times because we've never been given the opportunity to actually be asked, well, how would you want your culture to show up in this moment right here?
Yeah. Sometimes it's really beautiful when it's unspoken, and sometimes it really needs to be spoken. I supervise other clinicians, and we have these conversations a lot. But that's why in the beginning I said, identity isn't everything. And it's a common mistake of like, oh, well, we both come from the same place. So like, I already know everything. And it's like, that can really backfire. So one thing I tell therapists is an easy way to ask is people don't want to feel like the spokesperson or now I don't know everything about my culture. Now I got to teach this person, the person who's I'm paying to help me. Like, I'm not doing all that. So I don't say, tell me what that means or what is that? I've never heard of that. Those are obvious. You don't want to be sounding stupid like that. But instead of saying, tell me what that means, you just say, tell me what that means for you. But what does that mean in your family or for you personally? And as you're learning and sharing, the person is in therapy. They are the expert on themselves. They are teaching you about their own personal experience, and you're allowed to ask and you should ask. There's a difference between saying, "Oh, what does that mean for this group of people and they're like, I don't know, girl, like I just know that in my family we do this. So it can both create a sense of safety by saying like, oh, my therapist is here to understand me. The same way they would say, this is how I deal with my depression, or this is how I handle a breakup, or this is how I'm grieving something. I want them to know what it feels like for me. So you're supposed to ask.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't go to my client and be like, well, what do people usually do when they grieve? They're like, I don't know. That's why I'm here talking to you, girl. Like, what? So I just remind people to do that. And I also remind people that sharing a culture is not always a benefit. Sometimes it's really helpful to be a little bit separate. I get a lot of people who are not Afghan, but they're like, you're close enough, but it doesn't feel like I'm seeing my family member for therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. I don't want to feel like I'm seeing my Aunt Sarah for therapy. So I'm glad that you are familiar enough, but you're actually not. And there's no chance we're related either, girl, because I'm sure we're all cousins at some point. Sometimes people say, oh, you should refer out. You don't have the cultural competence. They should be seeing a queer therapist. And I'm like, yeah, but queer people have also been really harmed by other queer people. So it's not just an automatic, you have to be this or you can't be that.
Mm-hmm.
As we love to say, it always depends on the relationship, and there are ways that it can really benefit you.
So I'm hearing this sort of two kind of branches that we're talking about. There's the personal journey, right, of reconnecting, and then there's this journey as a therapist that you have been in, and at some point they kind of have crossed and then they diverge and kind of come back. What is it like to be the eldest daughter in your family who has been challenging, learning, speaking about tracing or remaneuvering things that maybe your family saw a certain way? What has that been like for you to go through this personal and this clinical journey in which you are maybe living a life that looks very different than the people that you come from, the people that love you and the people that support you, but yet again being so different? What has been that experience like in terms of reclaiming yourself back to the people that you already belong to in a way?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've noticed it has improved a lot of my relationships, particularly with my immediate family. Nadia, if you're listening. I'm just kidding. My little sister's like, improved relationships where? No, I'm just kidding. But it has also distanced me from other people. And in my perspective, some of the things that make me the most Afghan, I often say the things that people love about me, about my being outspoken, about being very generous, about having great style, even. Those are because I'm Afghan, but so are some of the other things that people have a hard time accepting. And I'm sure I could probably guess what they are, but I don't know what they are because we don't talk. But I focus on the people that have come closer to me as a result and maybe even shared their own experience and said, I'm glad you're doing this because I really appreciate it, which is their way of saying like, yeah, me too. The other thing I would say is the relationships that have improved because of this did so because the people had the capacity to come meet me and to take on those challenges. And often when people come to me and say, oh, I'm navigating my parents' relationship or I don't feel connected to my family, and I remind them that you can do everything that you can, and you can take my advice or not, you can do it right or not, you can try really hard and try to challenge yourself and overcome things and open your mind and be flexible. If the other person does not have the capacity to do it, it doesn't mean you did it wrong. So I just remind people that it also requires the other people to have capacity. And sometimes they don't. And it's not because you just didn't try hard enough.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. A lot of the times I have been in positions where like it's like outcome, right? The outcome that you hope because you led this conversation or because you did this one thing, it didn't lead to the outcome and it can feel like a failure. And that's what you're challenging and saying if the other person for whatever valid reasons according to their humanity and their life, they don't have capacity, how do you detach your feeling that you did good or that you tried something new or that you're learning to be with yourself or with others differently, that is not contingent on the outcome being this perfect specific way of being, because that other part may not necessarily be in your hands and it doesn't take away from the effort, from the reconnection, or maybe even being made fun of or being like, you're doing that, right? It can feel like a discouragement or like you're in therapy. Like, why do you go to therapy? Things that sometimes in different cultures that are not westernized, like they may have like a little bit of like a bat of an eye of like, why are you doing that thing? That's just different, weird, whatnot. And it is okay for us to kind of find our own path through how do we want to reconnect to ourselves? What does that mean? And to not attach it to
Yeah.
how others perceive it, receive it, or change even, right? Like that's not
Yeah.
what you're coming to therapy for, or doing your own healing outside of even the therapy room is cannot be for the other people to change, but it has to be for the self. And maybe that is a contrary message from collectivistic cultures and individualistic cultures that we as children of the diaspora are navigating our independent adult lives in the United States, where you doing you is praised and highlighted. And then you have the collectivistic value, which is no, what you do is for everybody else. And so if I'm doing this and nobody else is changing, then is this a good decision, right? So that battle of collectivism and individualism, how does that show up more in Afghan culture? How does it show up for you, the balancing out of individualism and collectivism?
You really said it really beautifully. The metric of success. Does this count? If I often tell people, like, I see couples mostly, and I'm like, look, we're going to work through this. You're going to improve. If your relationship makes it, that's great. If your relationship doesn't make it, you still get the benefit and you're taking this growth with you to your next relationship. So you benefit anyway. And it's similar to what you're talking about here. But for some cultures, they're like, yo, if it doesn't benefit all of us, it doesn't count. What do I care if your mental health is improved? But we know that while it might be unfortunate that, we can't save every relationship, but we know that it is benefiting the rest of our circles and any future generations. And we are redefining what it means to be Afghan and ourselves. So I think it's really similar to what you're describing. It's that familiar thing where my parents don't know what I do for a living, or I say, oh, this is a really cool job. And they're like, how much does it pay? And you're like, I mean, also I like it and I'm helping people. And they're like, it just doesn't register for them. So they have different metrics of success.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like a funny internet meme, but it does sometimes represent if it's not benefiting us in some way, literally financially, but also our reputation or anything else, then it doesn't count. And that can be very confusing for people. That's all I would add. I think you said it really
Mm-hmm.
beautifully.
Thank you. Maybe I thought about the work that you're doing with couples. Working with bicultural couples is something I really, really enjoy because it is about building a new world based on like these two very different worlds that we've made a lot of assumptions that we have just thought, the romantic, rom-coms from the 2000s. It's just like love just happens and it makes it happen. And it's like, it doesn't work like that. Being in a healthy relationship is a lot of work. And then when you come from different cultural backgrounds where there is cultural values, where there is assumptions, where there is expectations, that is also another layer in terms of relationships. So taking advantage of that you are a relationship and couples therapist, could you speak a little bit on how do you see the conversation globally that we're having showing up in relationships? Because I think that is something that is maybe not being talked about as loudly as other parts of this conversation out on the internet, but I know that relationships are deeply impacted by the histories and the coping mechanisms and the intergenerational passing down of both values, but also traumas at times, right? So how do you see this conversation show up in couples or with the queer folks or with the high achievers that you're working with?
Yeah, it's influenced by all of those things and in a very real way, also extremely current contemporary events. People are having real values-based disagreements and like fundamental changes in their relationships based on what's going on right now. And I love that you mentioned rom-coms, and I'm like, girl, we can't all be made in Manhattan, which is such an offensive, stupid movie. But I love it. But anyways, something I say is every relationship is intercultural, even if you come from similar backgrounds. If there are different gender experiences, if there's different cultural, class, trauma history, everything, we're bringing two completely different worlds together. The short way of saying it is you do look at intersectionality. People just love throwing that word around, but it's true. And I look at relationships as sort of a power negotiation. And in some ways, you might have more power than your partner because whatever, you are white or whatever, you might have the upper hand in that way. And in other ways, you might be at a less privileged position because of some other thing. And it could be confusing for people because they don't realize that that's what's going on. This didn't sit right with me, but I'm realizing it's because of all these other things that are at play. We can't ignore them. So it's not just the two people in the room. It is all the stuff that they're bringing with them and the stuff that is put on them, the stuff that they have to carry. I do think it comes down to the power differential and how we can create intimacy and safety with all of those differences. We can't ignore them, but we also don't want to exploit them and just say like, okay, well then there's nothing you can do unless you date somebody who's literally exactly like you, which is never going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that when we ignore, when we over romanticize and just assume that this is supposed to be easy, it can even get more frustrating rather than a let's build a bridge together, right? Like that's like the analogy that I always use when I'm doing couples work is just like there's two different worlds here. You're saying you want to be together, you're coming to therapy, you're here. What is the bridge that we're building? And if every time what you're doing is taking a brick off the bridge, it's going to be really hard to come toward, right? And so when we are in relationships, whether it's romantic, platonic, friendships, family, the more that we know ourselves and the more that we understand why do we care about the things that we care about, why do we value the things that we value, then that negotiation can become much easier, right? And that's like the whole self-discovery. And like once you understand yourself, then you can communicate it a little bit better and then build toward. And I think that's why for me it's valuable to be having these conversations like today and other conversations in the podcast, because I think what I'm trying to highlight to folks is this story matters. It's going to matter in a different amount of way depending on current events, life and whatnot, but it matters. And it also may create barriers. And so the more they understand it, the more that then you get to have a little bit of a say about what parts do you keep, what parts do you let go, because not everything that we're bringing forward into those relationships, even if well-intended, is going to be a good fit. Some things are actually not going to be a good fit, even if they worked for your family.
Yeah.
Sometimes I hear people say, yeah, but my mom and my dad, and it worked for them. And that's great that it worked for them. And I'm glad that you had an experience or you can hold that moment with such love and comfort. But in your relationship, it's not working out the same way because you and your partner are not your parents. And so these things that are really beautiful over here, that are helpful over here, may not be working here. And so the more that we have this awareness and sit with ourselves about what are the things that impact me, how, then the more ownership that I can have, going back to the internal, the more empowered that I may feel to then make decisions that match the current moment and that match where I'm at versus continuing to try to fit this puzzle piece into a place that doesn't, just is never going to fit perfectly.
Yeah. And I think too, people hear that and they're like, oh my God, it's so much work. Like, can't we just talk about our own relationship? It's true. We're looking at all of that stuff that everybody's bringing. And we're also looking at your own personal experience too. What role did you play in your family? Are you more comfortable? Are you used to not speaking up? Are you used to being ignored? Are you used to taking charge of everything? Those things also play a role in it. So we have to hold both as couples therapists. I'm not, like I've said this whole time, it's not just your own personal experience and it's not just, what the world did to you. We have to really balance both. And yeah, it is a lot of work. That's why.
It is work.
That's why you need help with someone to do it.
So if it feels hard, maybe it's a good time to get a little helper to help you translate the two worlds and build the bridge. Well, this conversation has been so amazing. I like to end with kind of two questions. And the first one is, would little Sara, whatever age comes to mind, what would that version of you be most amazed to see you be doing now? Is there a version of Sara, younger Sara, that would be looking at right now, seeing you and be like, dang, like, you're so cool, or like, dang, you did that, kind of like on your podcast, right?
Yeah, you know what? Probably just doing this, honestly, like speaking up and being visible. And I always say I'm a celebrity in my own mind. Delusional. I just want to be like really, really well known. And as a kid, I was really, really shy and quiet, if you can believe it. I know, imagine. But I think she would be really excited and probably surprised. They're like, oh my God, like you are really putting yourself out there. And she would have never thought that I could do that.
That's awesome. Yeah, look at you. Look at that.
I know,
shy.
so cute.
It came over here. Now I'm gonna ask you what your sign is.
Yeah, it's super obvious. I feel like once I tell people, they're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
I love it. And the second question to kind of close us off is about your tia legacy. So our podcast, Entre Tías y Amiguis, aunties and friends, right? Is like, I see the aunties as the people that are passing on the wisdom that are in that different relationship from your parents, or like this other bonus adults. And so Tia Sara, what is the Afghan word for auntie? Maybe that would be a fun.
Oh, it's different if it's on your mom's side or your dad's side, but usually you would say khala or kror.
Okay.
It's cool.
All right.
It's
Well,
fine.
I'll keep the auntie because then that feels like I need like way more learning on that one. So, Tia Sarah, for the purpose of our podcast, what you hope to leave behind when people think about you in the future generations, about the work that you've done, both personally, professionally, and just as a human in this planet?
Probably something around permission, like you can do it, and whatever that thing is that you like. I often tell people, think about the last thing that you think you would do and to do that, because I don't like to say, well, if so and so did it, then I can do it. That's kind of true though. It doesn't matter if they do it or not, but I do want people to look at everybody around them and realize that that gives them permission and an invitation to do the thing they want, rather than saying, well, because they did, it's already done, I don't need to do it. That's colonization at work. The more people do it, it is actually an invitation for you to do it as well, whatever your thing is.
So whatever you're thinking about doing, you can do that.
Hell yeah.
And there is space and there's need, and we want to hear from you. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing your time and your heart with us today. And to all the folks, Entre Tías y Amiguis, until next time. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with your tías and amiguis. Your support helps us reach more people and continue these important conversations. And don't forget to follow us on social media and stay connected. Until next time, remember to take care of yourself, embrace your journey, and keep living life with heart, vision, and creativity.